Chapter 4. Trinita. One Sunday in June, a small bird a good deal like a sparrow flew into Trinity Church. He flew down the centre aisle, and evidently drawn to it by the light, perched on the brass cross underneath the exquisite chancel window. When the choir began to sing, he joined in at the top of his voice, then flew over to the bishop's chair, peeping and chattering away, making himself as conspicuous as possible. Of course, like anything new in church, he took all the attention of the congregation from the minister. From the bishop's chair he quickly flew on a girl's shoulder, who caught him in her hand and put him on the stone steps outside the door. Here the little traveller was picked up by another little girl, taken to Sunday school with her, and finally brought to me. The poor bird was almost fainted, and I hurried him up to my hospital, which at that time had but one patient, Theodore Roosevelt, a wild pigeon who had been badly burned by an electric wire. I gave him crackers and milk. It is better for birds than bread and milk, and easier to swallow, and when he had had his fill, he tried to tuck his head under his wing to go to sleep. This he had to give up, as he had a large head but few feathers, and small wings, but he nestled up in my hand and was soon fast asleep. He was not a handsome little fellow. In fact, he was very homely. Some thought him an English sparrow, but I doubt whether he was, as they were all so timid, and he was far from that, always wilful, and did just about as he pleased. All day he stayed on my finger or dress, and when it began to grow dark, he discovered the negligee I had on was open at the throat, and a fine place to crawl into. I rocked him to sleep that night, and always after that he would not stay in his basket at night 1 minute, unless I first rocked him to sleep on my bare neck. Don't you think Trinita is a pretty name? I gave him that as he went to the service at Trinity Church. Everyone said he did not know his name, but I thought he did. After he had been in the hospital for a couple of weeks, he ran, or rather, flew away. I had been trying to sew and I could not keep him off me. He would crawl into the palm of my right hand, and did not seem to care how hard I squeezed him, then into the left, and did not mind a prick or two from the needle. I saw the sewing did not make much headway, so finally I gave up and started to take my work downstairs. I closed the door, or else he would have flown right after me, but I forgot the blinds were open in my dressing room. He evidently went in there, and the temptation to fly out was too much for him. On my return to my room I looked everywhere, and had given up all hopes of ever seeing him again, when I spied 3 birds down the street, 2 large ones and a small one, which looked suspiciously like Trinita. When I got near enough I began to peep, and the large ones flew away, but the little one went hopping along, and when within a few feet I called out, "Trinita! Trinita!" He turned in an instant and stopped. I put out my finger and he hopped on. It was noontime, and the street was full of people who looked with wondering eyes to see a wee bird in the middle of the street hop on my fingers. It proved he knew his name at any rate, and I was so glad to get him back that instead of scolding I was only too glad to give him something to eat and rock him to sleep. He was a forlorn-looking mite, all mud and grass stain, and so tired and faint that he could hardly perch. I think he too was glad to get back, for he never ran away again. One evening a little boy and girl came rushing to me with 2 filthy baby sparrows. Their legs and claws were so encrusted with smelly mud they could not hop, so the first thing was to get as much off as possible before they could be put to bed, and in the morning I gave them a bath in violet water, after which Jack and Jill, for so I named them, looked far better, and Jack turned out to be a perfect beauty. Trinita became rather jealous of them, and one day, when Jack and Jill were close together on my chest, he hopped down upon my shoulder, wedged himself in between them, and pecked at them until they flew away. Teddy Roosevelt, the pigeon, as was right, lived in the executive mansion, but Trinita did not stand at all in awe of him. He went in to see him quite often, and made his presence known by nipping his toes or pulling his tail feathers. Teddy, however, did not like it, and often he would drive Trinita out. Jill was very much in love with Jack, and often would do anything he told her, but one day she thought she would coquette a little and not mind. Jack tried his best to get her to come inside the cage, but she paid not the slightest attention to him. At last he went to the open door, took her by the wing, and pulled her inside just as a mother would take a child. We all thought it very cunning, but the next day when Trinita seized Jill by the leg and dragged her way across the floor, I thought it a bit too much, and gave Trinita the good scolding he deserved. Jack and Jill, however, were really most annoying to Trinita, chasing after him, screeching and opening their bills very wide, just as if he was their mother and would drop some goodies in. One day he was perched on the windowsill of the executive mansion, when up came Jack and Jill with gaping mouths. In turning to go away, Trinita saw on Teddy's floor a piece of court plaster that had come off from his wing. Trinita picked it up and dropped it in Jack's mouth. He spit it out, and then the tender morsel was thrust down Jill's throat by Trinita. After that they never begged him to feed them. Most birds get used to certain dresses that a person wears, and usually are frightened when they see them in anything else, but Trinita was never afraid. Once I put on a large hat covered with pink roses, thinking surely that would frighten him, but he only tucked his head under his wing and went to sleep on my shoulder. Another time I put a rustly silk skirt over my head when he was on top, but not an inch did he budge. When dressing, he would often get inside my waist, and I would fasten it up, leaving just enough room for him to stick out his head. He did not mind soap and water in the least, and very often would perch on me while I was taking my morning bath, keeping up an incessant chatter through it all. He delighted in visitors, and would light on their hands without the least sign of fear, and one day he tried to perch on a gentleman's bald head, but found it too slippery. Children all loved him, for he was not at all exclusive, and would let them handle him all they wished. The rougher I played with him, the better he liked it, and I would throw him here, there, and everywhere, but he would be back on me quicker than a flash. I do not believe many birds help make the bed in the morning, but Trinita used to try to, and seemed to think it great fun. He would fairly run from bottom to top and back again, never minding if sheets and blankets were thrown over him. When the day's bread was put on, he was told to keep off, but he seldom obeyed, and would play a long time trying to pick up the embroidered pink flowers. At that time, 2 or 3 birds were brought into the hospital nearly every day. Some died from wounds, and some from starvation when I was unable to make them eat. One day I had a forlorn baby sparrow, a dainty yellow bird not much larger than a bumblebee, and 2 baby Baltimore orioles. When night came, I felt like the old woman who lived in her shoe, for I had so many birds I didn't know what to do. I could not supply them all with separate baskets, so I took a large round one, all gilded, and filled it with cotton, then made little indentations in it so it looked like many little cots. First the strangers were put in, next Jack and Jill, and they all lay quietly. But when it came to Trinita, there was a row. He evidently had no intention of sleeping with that motley crowd, and would not stay in 1 second. He knew his own basket, and would never sleep in any other, or have any bird sleep with him. In the morning one of the orioles was dead, but another a year old came to take its place. He was a beauty, but had been shot by some cruel, wicked boy. 1 wing was broken, so he could never fly again, and he had a bad sore, so for days I thought he could not live, but careful attention brought him out all right. I named him the Prince of Wales, and the other oriole the Princess, who turned out to be the biggest mischief you can imagine. About that time, a dear little chipmunk, whom I named McKinley, came to the hospital, and his life was made miserable by the princess. She would steal his food, examine his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth with her long bill, and when he would not be looking, would give his tail a good pull. The morning of the 4th of July was intensely warm, so I moved all the birds into the hall where it was cooler. Trinita was put by himself, because if he was shut up in a cage with Jack and Jill, he would amuse himself by pecking them and not letting them on any of the perches. If they would try, he would lift them up by the feathers of their heads, then throw them down onto the bottom of the cage. Jack and Jill then were put in a separate cage with the prince and princess, and they all looked very sleepy when I darkened the hall and went out. Few people who keep birds, especially wild ones, know that they like to be in the dark during the middle of the day, and it simply ruins a canary to be left in the sun all day long. You may imagine my surprise when I returned to the hall half an hour later to find the prince in the cage alone. One of the birds had pried open the place where the food dish had been, and Jack, Jill, and the princess had gone through the shutter. The prince probably realised he could not fly, so stayed at home. I never found any trace of Jack and Jill, but after looking an hour located the princess. I had only had her about a week, and did not think she knew her name. As soon as she heard my voice, she answered, but was afraid to come down, as there were many boys with firecrackers in the street. Finally, she was frightened to the top of a very tall tree, where some robins chased her, and she flew blocks away. A hard thunderstorm came, and the rain fell in such torrents that I was sure I had seen the last of my pretty princess. After having her liberty for hours, I thought I heard her voice in the next street. I went to the open window and called, "Princess!" She answered, and every time I called, the answer came nearer. Soon I saw her fly across the street and light on the roof of a house. I hurried over and held my hand as high as I could. When down she flew and lighted on my finger. I think it marvellous her coming back, especially as she'd been gone for over 4 hours. Taffy grew more and more jealous of Trinita every day, probably not liking it that I kept him with me so much of the time. He insisted upon staying in the hospital all day, and often there would be 9 or 10 birds loose in the room. Frequently he would be there for hours before I knew it, and then I would not know if I did not happen to hear the bells on his collar. Then I would lift up the valance of the bed and find him stretched out full length, looking as happy and lamb-like as though there was not a bird anywhere near. One day a lady saw him trying to catch a bird in the street, and she called out, "You silly cat, why don't you go upstairs where there's a room full of them?" He would never pay the slightest attention to the birds until I would come in the room and Trinita would light on me. Then he would come up to me, wave his tail, and seem consumed with jealousy. One evening when he saw Trinita on me, it seemed he could not contain himself any longer. He was like a wild tiger fresh from the jungle. I could not pacify him, so sent him downstairs. At dusk I stood in my dressing-room door and saw Taffy sneak under my bed. I was called down suddenly and forgot him. When I went back a few moments later, I missed Trinita at once. When I could not find him, I remembered Taffy and rushed down to look for him. He came out from the cellarway looking pleasant and happy. I took him directly up to my room and asked him about his little brother Trinita. He rubbed against me, purred, and the fierce tiger had all left him. I took him down and said, "Taffy has not taken Trinita, for he never looks or acts like this when he's guilty." In a few moments I was called out on the back stoop, and there sat Taffy with Trinita's mangled remains before him. When he saw me he began to cringe and crouch, and there was not the slightest doubt of his guilt. I never knew him to eat a bird before, and I feel sure when he heard me calling him, he swallowed Trinita almost whole, thinking I would never find out where he went. And of course it made him deathly sick. Late that evening he came into my mother's room. First he stood in the door. I did not notice him. He kept coming nearer and nearer, and finally jumped into my lap, putting both paws about my neck, and began loving me. For days he was in disgrace, and for 2 months he never entered my room. He hated Trinita out of pure jealousy of me, so killed him. He has never noticed the other birds since, and sleeps quietly for hours with any number flying about him.